creditors, other public groups, regulatory bodies, among others. Okay, so they do not have a direct connection with the organization.
Hello?
Right. This.
Please, who is this?
Oh my God! Mute your microphone.
Oh, Diana. Yeah.
Anyway, so for secondary stakeholders, this is an example of secondary stakeholders. You have the general public, you have regulators, like I said, the media, you have activist groups, you have associations, and then you have communities. Okay, so these may not, even though they have a stake in the organization, it is not as direct as the primary stakeholder. And you can see that you have the primary stakeholders here in the middle, and you have the secondary stakeholders here, right? How do you identify stakeholders? The ISO 2600 clause says that for you to identify a stakeholder, you must ask yourself, to whom does the organization have legal obligations? So if it's a textile industry or it's a food chain company, who do you have legal obligations to? Okay, it is not one size fits all. It depends. So here you are looking at somebody who might be positively or negatively affected by what you do. Okay, so if you set up a nightclub just opposite UPSA, who will be your stakeholders? Not long ago, there was a betting shop opposite UPSA, right? And for me, I was concerned because then the stakeholders would have been, it was in the hostel, well, Prestige Hostel is. Then the stakeholders would have been the students. And I have worked in a betting shop before, not in Ghana. I was a shop manager in a betting shop, and I know what betting can do to people. Even though when you're winning, it's nice, it has a negative effect on people as well. Gambling has a negative effect on people as well. So the question was, to whom does the betting shop have legal obligations to? Thankfully, I think the betting shop is not there anymore. Okay, so that's one. Okay, two, still on legal obligation, who is likely to express concerns about the decisions and activities of the organization? Still on the betting shop that was opposite UPSA, I, as a lecturer, expressed my concerns about why we should have a betting shop as a student at Prestige Hostel, knowing the dangers of gambling. Okay, so who is likely to express concerns about that? Okay, so basically, these are the things that, so I, as a lecturer, I'm a stakeholder when it comes to what happens in the area, and I wasn't too pleased about it because I thought that was going to have a negative effect on the students. Okay, the other question is, who can help the organization address specific impacts? That's one. Who can address or who can help address specific impacts? So in identifying your stakeholders, who is it internally or externally that can address specific impact? Who are those that can do that for you? That's another thing. And who would be disadvantaged if excluded from whatever it is that you're doing there? All these are keys or guidelines that you can use to identify your stakeholders, be it whatever business that you choose to conduct. Okay. Problems with stakeholders. The main issue with stakeholders is that most of the time, what they want or what they expect from companies is different from what the heads of the businesses have in mind. So there's direct conflict. So here it says that a common problem that arises from companies with numerous stakeholders is that the various stakeholders' interests may not align with what the company wants to do. Their interests may be a direct conflict. An example is given here of the fact that shareholders want to maximize profit and enhance shareholder value, but the stakeholder may have a different, and what you need to know is that Shareholders are stakeholders. All shareholders are stakeholders, but not all stakeholders are shareholders. Okay, stakeholders are not necessarily shareholders, but all shareholders are stakeholders. That's the difference. Okay, in terms of labor cost, shareholders may be okay with it, stakeholders may not be okay with it. Okay, so these are some of the problems that you may have with stakeholders, because you see the shareholder has invested money and is looking for profits or some sort of benefit. So his way of doing things may be different. But if the other person on the other side is just a stakeholder and is not a shareholder, he may also have another view. For instance, if that stakeholder we are talking about is an employee, okay, that could also create a problem. So for instance, shareholder says, you people should work to this level so that we can make this amount of money. That may upset the employees, but because it means that the employees would have to work more. So these are some of the issues that we may have with stakeholders. So here it brings us to the differences between stakeholders and shareholders. Like I said, shareholders are always stakeholders in a particular corporation, but stakeholders are not always shareholders. Okay. Remember, a shareholder owns part of a public listed company. Okay. A stakeholder's interest may be different. Okay. If you're an employee, the fact that you're an employee or you belong to the media doesn't necessarily mean you have a financial interest in the company. Okay. So basically, this is one of the major difference between shareholders and stakeholders. So far, we have looked at who a shareholder is. And a shareholder is basically someone who has a financial interest in a company, and they have rights. They have rights to attend meetings. They have rights to inspect the company. A majority shareholder is one that has 50% shares. My minority shareholder is one that has less than 50% shares. We have looked at who a stakeholder is. We have literally said that stakeholders can be primary or secondary stakeholders. Primary stakeholders are those that have direct relationship with the organizations, and the secondary ones are those that do not have direct affiliations with their organizations. Okay, they may be affected by what happens, but and then the difference between the shareholders and the stakeholders is that shareholders are stakeholders, but not all stakeholders are shareholders. The problems with stakeholders is that most of the time, what they want may be in conflict with what the shareholders or other investors in the organization want. Okay, so now let's look at the OECD principles of corporate governance. The OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, the foundation of every corporate governance principle stems from the OECD. Wherever in the world, whether it's in Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, the UK, all the principles that we have, that we apply in our organization, comes from the OECD. Okay, it's in 6 parts, but it breaks up in so many, you can break it down in so many ways. So here it says that the OECD publishes the OECD principles of corporate governance. Now, the focus of these principles is to help organizations develop a culture of value, especially for profession, for professionalism, and then also for ethical behavior. Okay, so the whole idea of these principles is to ensure that there's some level of professionalism and then ethical behavior. So what you see on your screen are the 6 principles of OECD, and they are: 1, ensuring the basis of an effective corporate governance framework. Companies must ensure that they have an effective corporate governance framework. 2, ensuring that the rights of shareholders are in place and that we know who they are and what their functions are. So the rights of shareholders is the second one. Equitable treatment of shareholders is the third principle. The role of stakeholders in corporate governance is the fourth principle. Disclosure and transparency is the fifth principle. And responsibilities of the board is the sixth principle. So let's look at the first principle. Ensuring the basis of an effective corporate governance framework. What it means is that companies are to ensure that they have a good corporate governance framework that promotes what? Transparency. Disclosure and transparency is the lifeblood of corporate governance. I've always said that two key words in corporate governance is what? Oversight and accountability. How do you account for what you have done to your shareholders? Through being what? Through disclosure. By disclosing, you have to be transparent. Okay, so there has to be a framework in place that will promote transparency in the organization. There has to be a framework in place that will promote what? Efficient market. An efficient market. There has to be, this must be consistent with the rule of law. So in as much as you have these corporate governance principles, these frameworks and principles that you put in place must be in line with our Companies Act. Okay. These framework must also have what we call division of responsibilities. Who does what? Who is in charge of what? Who is going to be a supervisor? Who is the regulator? Who are the enforcement authorities? Okay, so there has to be a corporate governance framework. That is what the first principle says. The second principle has to do with the rights of shareholders and key ownership functions. Okay, corporate governance framework should protect and facilitate the exercise of what? Shareholders' rights. Here, the shareholders' rights include to secure methods of ownership registration. When you go and buy shares, you must be given what? A share certificate. You have to be registered into their register, their shareholders register, and then you are given a certificate. Okay. Where you want to transfer shares, you have the right to transfer shares. You have the right to obtain any relevant or material information